Hey everyone, welcome to Frank Analysis. I'm your host Franco. I am pleased to be joined again by Derrick Broze. He's a amazing journalist from The Last American Vagabond as well as the Conscious Resistance Network. He's also a documentary uh, filmmaker and an author of several books. Derrick, thank you very much for coming back on the show.
Hey, brother, appreciate you having me back on. And like I was saying to you before we started, I've been seeing your work growing, so good job keeping up with doing all the coverage you're doing.
Thank you, man. Same to you. It's important for us for people's awareness to grow about what's going on, especially with a lot of distractions that the media tries to present the population with, which is what you discussed in your article that we're gonna talk about here, which was that while people were distracted with what was happening at the Oscars with Will Smith and Chris Rock and everything, the international elitists, people like Klaus Schwab, etc., these World Economic Forum members, they met at the World Government Summit. I believe it's an annual event that's held. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is an annual event. I think it's been going on for I want to say just under a decade, but I personally, I mean, I'll admit I hadn't really heard about it until recently, and I'm pretty familiar with most of the different events like this happening, but this one it's under my radar.
Yeah, and for people who want to inform themselves about what the Great Reset is, if you don't know what it is yet, Derek Broze has a short documentary about 15 minutes that explains everything about what it is and who's involved. Pretty much, they're trying to have more control over the people, expand more surveillance. A whole bunch of powerful people around the world are involved, banks, etc., the Gates Foundation. But yeah, anything else I missed about that?
No, I mean that's like the sort of the short version of it. I try to keep it, as you said, in that little mini duck there, like 15 minutes long to break it down for people. It's pretty much what you described. The only thing I would add to it is that it's the sort of guiding philosophy of the Great Reset is technocracy, ruled by experts, ruled by scientific elite, using technology like things like AI, facial recognition, social credit scores to socially engineer society in the direction they think it should go. So top down management of our lifestyles, our lives
Yeah,
itself, using technology.
right, right. That includes digital IDs, vaccinations, and all that stuff. Now, one of the main things that you said was discussed at this forum. I mean, there was several panels. We're gonna talk about some of the ones that occurred at this event, but they announced the next phase of the Great Reset, which is the Great Narrative. And you wrote a piece in November 2021 talking about what the Great Narrative is. So, what exactly is this?
Yeah, so the great narrative is, I think we could refer to it as the next phase, the next stage in the Great Reset plan. So let's start with the Great Reset. As we were just describing what it is, it was announced in June 2020, a couple months after we were told there was a COVID-19 pandemic. Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum announced, COVID has presented the opportunity to reset capitalism, to reset all our systems, and we're going to create a more sustainable, more diverse, more equitable world, and this is our moment. That's kind of like the messaging that they were, at least on the surface, that they were trying to promote. So then in January 2021, at the annual World Economic Forum meeting, they unveiled like their full plan, vision of the Great Reset, Fourth Industrial Revolution, all these concepts. So that was January 2021. So as we were reaching the end of 2021, just last year, Klaus Schwab held another meeting that, as you said, I wrote an article about, and this one was in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, uh, talking about the next stage of the Great Reset, which he was emphasizing the importance of narrative, and they keep focusing on rebuilding trust. I think this is because they recognize that most people don't trust the large institutions. People have lost faith in governments and corporations, and obviously there's some people who are kind of brainwashed or still into that sort of authority worship, but a lot of people have come to question power in different ways, and these individuals recognize that, and so they're very focused on rebuilding trust and restoring trust and these kinds of ideas. And so the great narrative is their attempt now to expand not only the Great Reset of controlling all these different systems, remaking the economy, remaking education, remaking everything, food production, etc. But now the great narrative is sort of the acknowledgement that they also need to control the narrative. And I think that's become clear in the last 2 years. Those of us like yourself who've been trying to expose the different lies that have been kind of out in the open that the corporate media ignores and most people don't hear about can understand how important a narrative is, right? Because we're trying to get people to question the narratives and get them to look at different information, so-called alternative information, and the people that believe they are, the powerful. These people in these positions, they are trying to also craft a narrative that is their version of events, right? So one way or another, narrative is just a major role and major element of that. And this is the World Economic Forum, calling it the great narrative and just kind of acknowledging how important that's going to be in the coming years as they push forward in what they call the decade of transformation.
Right. Narratives is what they use to try to control, to try to manufacture consent. And if they're trying to advance stakeholder capitalism in the fourth industrial revolution, and they're going to try to find ways to convince the public, especially in the age where there's increase in gas prices, increases in debt, with all this privatization that's occurring in the United States, especially, and all this imperialism. They're gonna have to find a way to convince people. But one thing that I find pretty ridiculous is how they're using the UAE as a place to host the great narrative. Now, the United Arab Emirates is a country that has a lot of human rights issues. Why would they want to host it at the United Arab Emirates? Do they just not care, or what is going on there with that?
Yeah, so that's definitely one of the points I made in my first in the Great Narrative article, and then again in this most recent article about the World Government Summit, because they're both in these locations. For one, what it signals to me, just right off the bat, that the United Arab Emirates and specifically Dubai, which is just like a major growing economic center and financial center and cultural center, they're really kind of painting it as one of the future cities and these kinds of things. That it's going to be an extremely important part of the whatever phase of this new world order, however you want to describe that we're moving into, because these two events, World Government Summit, the announcement of the Great Narrative, these are really important events that are discussing the future of humanity essentially here, and they're meeting with like His Highness this and His Holiness this and the different royalty from that country who are now in these different positions of power. And I think it's interesting because they're definitely trying to sell it as if this is the younger, more progressive generation of the UAE royalty, and they're lighter on, they're better on human rights, and they're not as extreme about Islam and kind of punishing people who don't practice Islam or who who do things the wrong way. They're giving women more rights, and like for example, there was panels during the World Government Summit about how do we bring women into the sustainable development fight, and how do we, support Agenda 2030 with women, and just sort of these intersectional issues that's at least the way they're trying to make it look like, that are really just about trying to get the young, the progressive, the people who might think of themselves, I think, as generally good people who want to make a better planet, to entice them and get them to think that, oh, this is like something we want to be involved in. So I think that it's important to point out, as I did in the article, that as you mentioned, the human rights record of the UAE and the other factors that I mentioned, in addition to just, there's also some good research. I've been reminded recently by a friend, I didn't include this in my article, there is some history of Rothschild banking and really being involved with the growth, economic growth of that nation, of that area as well. And so I think that just generally speaking, there's more of the same power players that we're all familiar with that are comfortable with that nation, or have sort of, I guess, anointed it as one of the new powerful nations as we're moving into some element of a new world order.
And so Klaus Schwab, who's the chairman of the World Economic Forum, he spoke at this event, and there was a panel and after he spoke, there was a panel that was titled "Are We Ready for a New World Order?" which you just mentioned earlier. Now, people may automatically be dismissive when they hear that word and associate that with the conspiracy theories, or think that we're over exaggerating. But because of the phrase "New World Order," but this is literally what they named their panel. And what's more important is what they discussed and who was in that panel. And in that panel was someone named Fred Kemp. And he, along with others in the World Economic Forum, have strong connections with the Atlantic Council. So, what can you tell us about him, this panel, and the Atlantic Council, and what their role is with imperialism, as well as how they try to control the narrative on social media platforms with Facebook?
Absolutely. And I just want to say, like, again, I use the phrase New World Order in this context specifically because, as you just mentioned, there's a panel in the event we're talking about. But traditionally, like in most of my work, it's not a phrase that I really try to use. And it's not because I don't think that it is an accurate phrase, or because none of the politicians have used it, which they have and hundreds of times across countries, over decades. Really, it's because of what you mentioned, that there's such a stigma associated with the word. I think there's ways to describe it without using the phrase, but it's also worth noting, like, this is what they're calling it themselves. This is not me kind of spinning some conspiracy about, like, oh, they're creating a new world order. This is them saying, are we ready for a new world order? Now, you might
Yeah.
disagree, listeners might disagree and say, okay, but it's not some conspiracy to control the world in the way you guys are proposing or whatever. They might just think, yeah, they just mean the new countries that are going to be kind of leading the pack. Either way, it's the terminology they're using, and it is important. So I just wanted to preface that. And this panel, though, which was titled, as you mentioned, "Are We Ready for a New World Order?" is absolutely important to pay attention to. It's not something I think should be just dismissed, whether or not you believe it's conspiracy or just the name of a panel. Fred Kemp, so he's been with the Atlantic Council since 2007 as the CEO, and the panel also had a former CNN anchor and current CNN anchor and a former advisor to George W. Bush. So some people who've got some experience. And Kemp himself, before he worked with the Atlantic Council, he was a journalist with the Wall Street Journal for more than 25 years. So the Atlantic Council is an organization that I think some in the independent media have started to pay attention to in the last few years. I know I started paying attention to them in May 2018, which is when Facebook announced that they were going to partner with them. So if we go back to May 2018, this is, of course, Trump's in office, and we're hearing Russian hysteria constantly. And this was really one of the kind of amping up of the disinformation. This is the pre-COVID disinformation. They're saying people are spreading lies about the election, people are spreading lies about this or whatever, right? So Facebook starts announcing efforts to crack down on this disinformation. And one of these efforts was a partnership with the Atlantic Council in May 2018. And this was, they said, to work with their Digital Research Council specifically to fight against this disinformation. And so what I pointed out, and I think it's worth noting, again, worth noting in the context of Facebook and fighting disinformation, but also the fact that the president of this organization is sitting on a panel called "Are We Ready for a New World Order?" The Atlantic Council has been around since the early 1960s, and they're not officially, like, listed as, hey, we're part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, but it's clear that their missions are the same, and there's so much crossover that it's kind of meaningless to say they're not connected. So they've spent decades working with different organizations, politicians, journalists, etc., to promote issues and basically to promote the NATO mission and whatever benefits NATO. The Atlantic Council does that. And so they're a part of another organization called the Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that's like an even bigger umbrella organization that works with other groups to promote values that are favorable to NATO. And so, but the Atlantic Council, it's one of these think tanks, NGOs, and they invite out political leaders, economists, academics, military officials, journalists, all kinds of power players to go there and speak and come be involved and promote essentially whatever it is that NATO wants. And so this is, I mentioned a couple of people who spoke there: George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and then Zbigniew Brzezinski. For those who know him, he's been involved, for a long time, or he was involved before he was alive, with Western imperialism and New World Order politics. So that all happened in 2018, the partnership with the Atlantic Council and Facebook. Less than 6 months later was the first part of the purge, which some of us call October 2018 purge, when 500 plus pages were deleted across Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Some of the biggest anti-war, police accountability, and independent journalism websites were just deleted overnight, less than 6 months after Facebook partners with the Atlantic Council. So there's a clear effort by them and Facebook to try to control narratives, which leads us back to the great narrative. But also the president of that organization, the Atlantic Council, sitting down with former presidential advisors and CNN anchors discussing whether they're ready for a new world order. This is really important because the Atlantic Council, who they represent, is the Western bloc of the New World Order, if you will. Again, I'm using that phrase again, but I think it's important to try to understand this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe you've given it some thought. I'm sure the listeners have some ideas. I'm not sure if any of us 100% know, but this idea of a New World Order is, kind of a, whether you think of it as like China and Russia and some other non-Western nations are going to become the leaders of this New World Order, right? But we've heard the U.S. presidents using it over the years, right? There's some debate or discussion around whether or not we truly believe that these countries are even opposed, or if they're more united than we believed, or if they're less united. Maybe they aren't as a single bloc. If they're not a single bloc, if there is truth to that, which is what we see on the the stage in front of us, that Russia and China have conflicts with the U.S. and the U.K. and the Western governments. If that's true, on a deeper level, then at the least, the Atlantic Council represents the Western bloc of the New World Order, and China and Russia would represent something more like Eastern, kind of just non-Anglo-fied version of the New World Order. If that's not true, then it's all just a charade, and they're on the same side at the end of the day, despite maybe minor differences. But yeah, so that's kind of who the Atlantic Council is and the role they play. But what do you think about that? Have you given any much thought or research into that idea of whether there is true unity, or it's they're all really shaking hands behind the scenes, or if there really is some division between different factions?
I think that there might be something like similar interests, but there is like the people in charge of these countries, like the leaders. I think they have their own selfish interests about like, of course they want to beat the competition when it comes to certain resources, for their own selfish interests. But then I see things like this clip that I'm about to share of Xi Jinping saying that he's all in with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But then we see things like the Russia-Ukraine situation, the U.S. demonizing Russia, Russia being against the West. I, I think that this is all they use people like militaries, etc., as pawns, but at the end of the day, they have their own selfish interests. But there is something, I don't know, bigger that might be. I don't know. I'm not really sure. But I wanted to get your thoughts on this clip that I'm going to share here. What do you think about Xi
China will also
Jinping
continue.
saying this? But we see people saying that, oh, but China, they want to advance socialism. Like they actually do care about the people. But here they are, all in for capitalism with the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
China will also continue to work for the joining of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, with a view to further integrating into the regional and global economy and achieving mutual benefit and win-win results.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, personally, for me, I think that I don't really see how anybody can think that the Chinese government cares for its people. I mean, unless you think that various elements of authoritarianism are how you show you care about your people. I hadn't seen that clip. That is interesting, and maybe that is sort of an example of what I'm talking about, right? That just another example of whatever your thoughts are on their philosophies. Like they can proclaim they're for the people or for the average worker or whatever. But everybody who studied the TPP, especially when it was really big during the Obama years and it was coming close to becoming an agreement they were all going to sign on board, that it was be bad for the worker, just like the NAFTA agreements and previous so-called free trade agreements, that have really just hurt the working class and ended up in some cases bankrupting countries. Like, I think that anyone supporting that clearly isn't on the side of the people. That alone is something to question, that narrative that China cares for its people.
Yeah. And I also want to point out, where's the screen? Julian Assange, political prisoner. I mean, he warned about China. I mean, I know a lot of people who support China as being like a savior country. Also believe that Julian Assange should be freed, and they stand with WikiLeaks, etc. But here is Julian Assange saying that China is one of the worst state offenders in terms of censorship. Um, and he goes on to say, and the article goes on to say, Assange, whose website has arranged and embarrassed Washington by releasing confidential U.S. diplomatic cables, said China was the main technological enemy of WikiLeaks, not the United States. China has aggressive and sophisticated interception technology that places itself between every reader inside China and every information source outside China, Assange told Britain's New Statesman magazine. We've been fighting a running battle to make sure we can get information through, and there are now all sorts of ways Chinese readers can get onto our site, he said, in extracts of the interview published on the magazine's website. And they have their social credit system also,
Exactly.
which
I
I'm
mean,
pretty
I know
sure,
you're familiar with that.
yeah, the US is, I'm sure, is taking elements from that and figuring out how they can implement that here in the US. So what do you think about that?
I mean, I think that the point that Assange made there is important, and that's definitely a reason. And then you said it before I could, the social credit score. Like I would just ask anybody who really truly believes that China is somehow like the savior of its people, that why they have little freedom of speech and why people who are tied to things like social credit score, why China is already implementing the technocratic methods that the Great Reset is pushing for. Like I don't see how you can look at that situation and come away thinking that there's something positive happening there. Not to say that there aren't good people, of course, like, or that maybe even attempts within the country to create better systems or do better things. But overall, like on a whole, I mean, I'm not going to be endorsing the Chinese system any more than I would endorse the US system.
Right. And I do want to point out how the Great Reset was started as a response to COVID-19. And there was this event called Event 201 where they ran a simulation on how the world would respond to a coronavirus. And this was before, a few months before 2020. It was in October, I believe. So, and China played a role in that. I can't remember. It was Gao, I think. I can't remember his first name, but the chairman of the CDC of China was there. So there
Yep.
is, like, to answer some of your question from earlier about, is there, are they all collaborating with each other? I think that they receive messages from, I don't know, powerful people higher up, but at the end of the day, these leaders of these countries have their own selfish interests. And like I said, they use people as pawns. Like they don't care about people that they use as soldiers to get into wars or
Exactly.
drones that they launch. At the end of the day, to
Exactly.
them, it's just a playground.
Well, it's what you said. We just see the average person as a pawn, and I think that's probably somewhere in there is closer to the truth. Like I would imagine that there are cultural and national interests that specific political politicians have, and sometimes those line up with other people's plans, and sometimes they don't. But at the end of the day, they're going to side with each other 9 times out of 10, or maybe 100 times out of 100, before they would side with the people. Because we're just beneath them. So they might fight with each other at different points, but also at the end of the day, I think their interests probably would align more than those of the people who are trying to get rid of them.
It's like politicians, right? They put on a whole show about how the Democrats oppose the Republicans, but that's because they have their own selfish interests and their own strategies and their own people who they're trying to appeal to. But at the end of the day, they receive they serve the donor class, and I mean there are very powerful people out there like the Rockefeller Foundation and other people with last names that start with R, who have a lot of influence on what these countries can gain if they're on their good side.
Yeah,
Um,
and I just want to mention, if I can, real quick, man, that if some of the things we've shared or just even kind of dipping our toes in during this conversation are maybe overwhelming to somebody, or they have a knee-jerk reaction to say this sounds crazy or that's a conspiracy theory, I do want to invite you to check out my website, thepyramidofpower.net. It's my 16-part documentary series. It's not complete yet, but we've released 8 episodes that go into a lot of the areas that we're kind of talking about here. So for those who might struggle to understand really just how deep the level of corruption and control and individuals and various institutions trying to manipulate the world to their ends, I encourage you to go check it out. It's in English and Spanish. You can see the first 8 episodes at thepyramidofpower.net.
and that's a great series that breaks down like how like what is going on like with big pharma, Hollywood, the food industry, all of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, we have
And
our next season coming out next month in May.
oh, I can't wait for that. It's
Yeah, it's
on
going to be the
Rockfin.
prison
It's on your
industrial
site.
complex. Yeah, I got it on my website and Rockfin and Odyssey, all the places. I'll just mention it the next season. So we're doing it like 4 episodes at a time, just breaking it up into 4 episodes, kind of in seasons, to instead of doing it all at once and releasing something really massive. So the next 4 episodes in May are going to be the prison industrial complex, the foundations slash the nonprofit industrial complex, the banking cartel, and the crimes of the intelligence community. So we're getting like deeper and kind of some bigger topics. And the last season will be even more deeper. We're going to get into some of that realm of what people consider conspiracy. But I encourage people to check it out, because just like with all my work with the documentary, everything is sourced in the transcript. I stick purely to facts. There's no speculation. In the later episodes, we'll have to get into a little bit of speculation of here's these people think, here's what these people think. But everything I've covered in these first 12 episodes is purely fact. It might be unbelievable to some, but it's fact, documented, sourced. So check it out.
And so going back to this event that they held at the World Summit, they also brought up the Russia-Ukraine situation, which a lot of people are paying attention to right now. Why did they bring this up at their event?
Well, I think it's just a clear sign that we talked about the Atlantic Council. We mentioned Klaus Schwab. There's the Secretary General of the United Nations. You got the Director General of the World Health Organization. You got the head of the TSA for some reason. You got all these different prime ministers and ministers of different positions from various nations around the world. There's some influential people there who have the ability collectively to influence the different arenas that they're discussing. And so when it comes to things like Ukraine, and I think let's see if I got the title here, that Ukraine gets into obviously the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but there was a panel called Post-Crisis Ukraine, New Energy for a New Europe. And I thought that was interesting too, because there was references to oil and gas and a net zero world, the Sustainable Development Goals. And a big part of the Great Reset and Agenda 2030 is pushing towards, away from fuel vehicles, which I think is positive on some levels, but also towards things like in the digital world, driverless vehicles, you will own nothing and be happy. Things that we're told are going to be better for the environment, but also in many ways will lead to less privacy and I think eventually less freedom. So it is interesting that they're having that discussion around oil, energy, et cetera, and how that relates to Ukraine. And again, in that panel, you had 2 different people from the Atlantic Council also speaking, in that panel. And then you had another one called "Getting Off Russian Gas." And again, that one featured more Atlantic Council people. So these are people who have the ability to go back to their little spheres of influence and push in whatever direction they're claiming to. And I think that's important to these events. I mean, ultimately, it's important for us to focus on solutions, like what can we do for ourselves and our communities in the face of the Great Reset and things like that. But I do think it is important for those of us who want to keep up to be aware of what the people are talking about. They're discussing what they might be planning next. It's important to follow these events because they often very openly discuss their plans.
Right. And then Klaus Schwab said something about increase in oil prices, and that would be one of the things that would lead to civil unrest. I mean, what that is what we're seeing now. not just in the U.S. but internationally. In Yemen, the oil prices are up to like $9. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that if what they're talking about starts to reflect reality, we shouldn't be surprised. And we can go back to the exercise they did and the World Economic Forum did in 2021, and they did, a couple times over the last few years, the cyber pandemic exercise. There's been a lot of scares over the last 6 or 7 months, different hacks. We were told that was kind of amping up for a while, like, is there going to be a big hack? And then, of course, the narrative around food shortages, supply chain disruptions. There's been so many talks of that, and sometimes it's hard to parse between the propaganda that could just be being put out to keep us in a state of fear and keep people buying because they're in kind of in panic mode, or if we really are seeing sort of the agenda telegraphed right in front of us, and then we see it play out in real life. Either way, I do think that we should expect inflation to go up in different arenas. What's important to recognize, though, and I think this is important to recognize about COVID-19, the inflation, Ukraine, whatever the situation may be, that excuse me, that they are going to use whatever cover story they can to distract from the real issue. So, for example, in COVID, there was inflation going on, and it was because of the lockdowns and so many people having to go, go to not be able to work, that was causing prices to rise and get all the different things they could blame it on COVID. Now they're saying, okay, well, even we're getting these small amounts of imports from Russia, we're going to stop those now, and somehow that's going to affect the gas price. They're just using these cover stories for the fact that the banking cartel, and through the Federal Reserve System in the US, but really around the world, the central banking system, has continued to devalue the currency by continuing to print trillions and trillions of dollars. Well, not necessarily print, but you know what I mean, to create this money backed by nothing. And that's only increased in the last couple of years. And in COVID, they took it to a whole new level with giving out all kinds of money. They gave people $1,200 checks while they gave all kinds of corporations money. And, it was just another robbery. I definitely think looking back in the coming years, people will recognize, just like with the 2008 financial crisis, that the banks won and Big Pharma won during COVID-19, and the people were given, pennies. So there's bigger reasons to what's going on now, even though they might say it's the Russia thing, it's the COVID thing, and in the end, maybe it doesn't matter, right? Because if the prices go up and you feel it, that's all you're going to care about. You're not going to care if they say it was because of Russia or because of COVID. But the point is, if they keep people looking at the front story, people can't wake up and realize, hey, the people that are making these decisions are the ones causing this suffering to us, and maybe we should get rid of them. It's easier for them to blame, like, oh, a random virus or this act of war. Who could have predicted that, right? Instead of making it clear and obvious that they are the ones disrupting the system.
And I just want to point out here for the audience, these people at the World Economic Forum, they acknowledge that all these issues are problems, like COVID, the rise in gas prices, climate change. And I mean, we all agree these are problems too. It's just that the solutions that they propose are not real solutions. These are things that are going to mainly benefit themselves, which is makes up what, like less than 0.01% of the world population, and we will just continue to suffer more. They think that a solution is to merge the private industry with government to a point where it's just indistinguishable. That right there is equivalent to fascism. So it's important for us to start being aware of this and to start thinking about, okay, what is the actual solution out of this? Do we want a one world government, like what appears to be like what they're advocating for, where we aren't going to own anything and they claim that we're going to be happy, but we're truly not going to be happy because they're going to control our lives? Or should we move more towards more localized governments, or have, or what do you call it? What are some of the solutions that you propose, alternatively to having this dystopian one world government? More localization, growing our own food.
I mean, I think
What else?
those are great starting points for sure. And just to add to what you were saying before, that's one of the other tricks that the way these people work. What I really consider the predator class, like truly a predatory class of people on the rest of humanity, parasitic even, that they will discuss problems that are real and that are concerning to most people, I would say. And the problem is this: for one, the solutions they propose are things like put us in charge, we'll micromanage society, we're going to host our events, and we're going to get together and we're going to discuss how we're going to transform the next decade, right? So that's not the solution I believe in. But it is true. Oftentimes, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, you look at Agenda 2030, if you don't look beyond their propaganda language and their buzzwords, then when they say things like sustainability, diversity, equity, regenerative, et cetera, and now even the World Economic Forum and United Nations are getting to using words like decentralization. If you just take those words at face value, then it might sound like, wow, these people sound like they're looking out for humanity. Of course we should support this, right? But it's much deeper than that. And the other aspect of it is they sort of propose that they are the ones to come fix the day and save the day for us. But the reality is that they helped engineer these problems, so then they could propose themselves as the heroes to fix it. So I just think that's important to make clear. This whole order out of chaos is the way these people operate. But as far as solutions go, yeah, like localization of everything, I think is really key. And ultimately, I do believe in a liberty and a liberation that is individual, and that what I mean by that is that while I believe in collective liberation, I don't believe in collective solutions for the most part. I don't think that we can force people to be free, right? I don't think you can just pass a law and tell everybody, hey, you're now free, or I'm going to make these decisions for you, because that leads down bad roads. That's what these people think. They think they're making the best decisions for the best people, the most people, or whatever. So I want to encourage people by leading by example and saying, like, look, if you're concerned about the direction the world is going when it comes to 5G technology, that's going to be the backbone to the social credit score and the digital ID, the vaccine passport, the central bank digital currency, as part of this great reset technocracy agenda 2030, you owe nothing, be happy future. If you don't want to participate in that, then for me, it's 2022. Their agenda is 2020-30. It's time for us to really start thinking on a very practical level. How are we going to remain free in the face of that? How are we going to make sure that we can continue to feed ourselves, provide for ourselves, feed our families, take care of our lives without submitting to their systems? If you don't want to submit to facial recognition cameras, you don't want to submit to biometrics, then how are you going to make sure you can survive when that becomes the norm in the world that we are living in? Because that is where things are headed. And ultimately, I think it comes down to localizing and decentralizing in a real way. So, for example, you mentioned food production, like growing your own food. Decentralizing, localizing food production. We need more food production everywhere as possible, whether that means your backyard garden, front yard garden, volunteering at a community garden, urban farm, community co-op, whatever kind of opportunities you have, or even just a little windowsill garden in your apartment if that's all you can start with or afford, because it's a very real need. Let's imagine, even if some of the things we're hearing about potential supply chain disruption and food shortages, maybe that's all propaganda designed to keep us in fear. I don't necessarily think so, but I think some element of it could be. Let's imagine that's true. Even if none of these concerns were valid or warranted, at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, I don't want to be dependent on their systems. So I don't want to just act out of fear. I'm acting out of a place that I want to be in a position to help myself and help other people. I don't want to be in a position of scarcity. So if I'm not thinking ahead and some food shortage does come, or the inflation continues, or the cyber pandemic comes, or whatever sort of, this COVID variant BA2, whatever happens, and they roll out the whole next thing, I want to make sure that I can still take care of myself and my family. I don't want to be stuck out, oh, dang, now I can't go to the grocery store because I don't have a vaccine passport. I don't have proof of vaccine. I can't work. I can't travel. Right. So to me, the answer is to get as free from those systems as possible. That includes being able to grow or produce or localize as much of our food as possible, creating alternative trade networks. That's very much like the bigger vision of the Freedom Cell Network and what we're doing. But, I think whether it's food, getting off of the corporate media, thinking about getting your money out of the banks in a very real way. And again, as far as I'm concerned, if all you can do is stuff it in your mattress, it's still probably a better place than leave it in the bank, where you're supporting corruption, but also where eventually they might freeze it for you donating to the wrong cause or hanging out with the wrong people. If that happened to you, and then you can't pay your bills or feed your family beyond what cash you have in your hands, then you're going to regret still dealing with those people who are also criminals as well. So that's just the terms I'm thinking. And is like, look, I see what's coming. I'm going to keep trying to wake people up to the Great Reset. I don't know if we can stop it. I don't know if that's possible, but I'm going to focus on making sure I can remain free from their system so that I don't end up trapped in that digital dystopia, you know?
Yeah, and anything to take power away from these corporate overlords. And if you're thinking like, okay, like if I tell people about this, they're not gonna really want to do this. I'm worried about my community not accepting these ideas. At the very least, you can present these ideas to people, because you got to get the conversation started. We can't just like sit around and just keep all this information to ourselves. If we want a more conscious society, you got to help out by spreading the information, at least spreading these ideas to people. You'll be surprised at the amount of people who will agree with you about how we have these problems. And at the end of the day, you'll realize the best solution is to try to take as much power away from these corporations as we can. Is there anything else, Derrick? I know you got to head out. I really appreciate you coming on, man.
No, brother, that's pretty much it. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about that article, and I think we went some fun places with this conversation. It's been fun. I would just encourage anybody who's curious about my work. My writing can be found at The Last American Vagabond. I have an author page you can check out there to see all my past work, and my regular video reports and my documentaries and my books can all be found at theconsciousresistance.com. And then, as I mentioned, my documentary series is at thepyramidofpower.net. So thanks for giving me a chance to talk, man.
For sure, man. Thanks again. And everybody else, stay informed. You're not alone.